and initially started as a kind of sound residency, and I was looking into the transformation of the landscape because of the industry there, and the soundscape that this kind of industrial transformation generated, and how that was affecting the locals. And I'm talking about geothermal energy. In fact, this is the place where geothermal energy production was invented at the beginning of the 20th century. And when I was there, I came across 5 villages that surrounded this, huge network of power stations. It's one, but they're huge. There's this kind of huge network of pipes and power stations. And wandering through those villages was incredible, because they were abandoned. In one village, there was only one person, very old, who had stayed because she was too old to move. She couldn't actually move. And the rest were like these incredible modernist kind of social housing. It was workers' housing. And in London, I live on a council estate in Islington. But the quality of the building was incredible, but it was all uninhabited, and it looked like the aftermath of some sort of disaster or some sort of disaster scenario. And as I was walking, I came across, or rather a small boy of about 7 years old appeared. And it was very strange because there was no one else around. And my Italian is not very good, but somehow the fact that I'm bigger and taller than him, but my Italian is that of a child, and he's 7, he's smaller, but his Italian is much better than me. That somehow democratized our encounter. And we started, having an interaction, trying to speak to one another. And then suddenly his mum comes out of a bush. I think she was peeing there. She comes out of a bush and she grabs him and she leaves. Later on, I found out that, in fact, there were, she was an illegal immigrant, and she was staying in one of the abandoned flats. But that encounter was very important, and it instigated a whole line of inquiry, which implicated both the personal, the small, the intimate, and the bigger kind of picture, because the main question at that point, when the mother grabbed her son and left, was observation was that, okay, so what he wanted was different from what his mum wanted for him. Without interacting with me, she was suspicious of me, I don't know. But then when I scaled up that question, it became something else that was a lot more political. So what is it that the residents in that place, the former residents in that place, actually wanted for themselves and their families? And who was their mum or their dad that wanted something different? So the scenario is that basically the industry became automated. At the beginning, they needed a lot of people, so 5,000 workers and their families moved there. Since the 1920s, 30s, there was a huge population boom there in the 70s. But then as the factory in the 80s became progressively more automated, people started losing their jobs, and then they couldn't stay in those houses because the houses were offered by the industry. So the industry preferred to have the houses empty, than rented to them. And progressively that place became very dystopian. So that brought up a lot of questions about narrative. So who writes narrative? Who writes our life narratives? What is the agency we have over our own life narratives? And how can I work with local children, which is the community that I engaged with, to ask that question and to try to figure out answers with them and through their perspectives.
I think something that's so poignant as well is the fact that like empty houses do seem to be like a very central like image in both of these works as well. You have empty, it's very interesting that entities that control these houses would prefer to have them empty versus used by the people that are actually like in need of them at the time as well. So
but I also think that there was there's a really interesting and quite, well, you see, because the buildings were really run down, right? And so it became a kind of abjectness porn almost. So people were looking at these abandoned buildings, and either they're so romanticized because they're ruinous villages, or there are places that are literally equating the people who live within them as also a failed people. So a failed building, instead of looking at the structural policies that make a building be uninhabitable, within inner city London now we're talking in particular. And that's, for me, was really interesting to see the kind of movement of the public gaze onto a facade, that onto buildings that looked run down, and equating the people inside as abject. And I think this is what I'm really interested in is how do we make others of that, of people that are very close like us, right? We are all different, but we're all similar. We are human beings. But how do we make these others, and what are the kind of structural implications of that? And one of them is architecture, and one of them is the social policy, which then allows architecture to look a certain way. And it produces, therefore, like a kind of normative making, but also a formative making, appearance that becomes real in people's minds. And on top of that, when we were about to be demolished and the first phase of the buildings were demolished, right? Like all around us, there were buildings coming up, new buildings called Ability Plaza, Avant-Garde Tower, Canelato, Art House. And even the naming of these buildings has an implication, right? So there's language and there's the image production through architecture, but also then the kind of stock photographs around the estate were full of Kate Middleton lookalikes. So there's like a real so the people who living within these buildings are doubly unrecognized. So not only is their image becoming abject, but also their image is really actively erased through policy making, but also through the visual production of the kind of modern city or something, right? And so therefore it erases people. So there's the formation of an erasure, an active erasure going on about of communities and life experiences and lives.
In response to that, because I've lived in King's Cross for about 16 years, 17 years, and for a while it was the biggest regeneration and construction site in Europe. And it was very interesting to, I was very interested in the virtual architectural maquettes that were decorating those sites, those construction sites. And I started taking photographs on the mobile phone that I had 16, 17 years ago of those virtual maquettes. And I kept a record of these. Recently, I gave a presentation which consists purely of those maquettes, photographs of the virtual architecture maquettes, which then I'm trying to understand, to decode what they signify. And what is absolutely shocking is to see who is represented there, how the community that inhabits that, the existing community that inhabits that area is completely erased. It's not there. So they're building something that's not actually for us. It's for someone else who is not a neighbor. I don't know where they're gonna have to come. They're gonna have to ship them in. And also how gendered, racist,
able-bodied,
yes, yeah, actually the presentation was in the context of disability, not only in terms of the buildings they design, but also who is already represented. So there's no representation of any person that is a wheelchair user. So entire communities, sections of the population are excluded by ambition and urban design already before it's realized by design.
Was there any, I think capturing both of these communities in that way and kind of giving them that presence to kind of reassert themselves into that narrative, and that dialogue is really like an essential part of these as well. Was there like, what was the response by these communities to seeing themselves presented in this way?
So in Estate, for example, but also in all my work, we, for example, I mean, first of all, the process over the years became very much led by a probing of questions. For example, we presented these kind of questions: who has been erased by the stock photographs? And we collaboratively tried to think through what were the structural shifts throughout time. So for example, in the 1940s, there was one of the residents who was born there in the 1940s, and her father had committed suicide because he wasn't allowed to keep any animals on the estate, right? That's how the animals came to the estate, to actually ask us the questions around who do these buildings belong to, and how much freedom do we have to express to our fullest being who we are. And then, so through the workshops, and there's this really particular shift where people often say, oh, when the immigrants came in, that's when the estate started, when the demise of the estate started to happen in the UK. So there's this myth of the kind of white British working class, whereas the British working class is very diverse. It's incredibly diverse and has been for a very long time. So that myth, so we were trying to understand how did that start? And you know, and people were like, oh, because we used to clean our stairwells, for example. And then everybody said, but we are also cleaning our stairwells, right? Even though there's a cleaner. And then we found out, for example, in the early 1990s on our estate in particular, when cleaning stopped was because the caretaker had passed away, but it wasn't filtered down to the local authority office. So there was just nobody coming anymore cleaning for almost a year. And it was a mess because there was, it was again, like the council was in disarray, and it was blamed then on the people who tried to survive somehow and to try and make a home. So it was really done in that kind of spirit of let's try and figure something out. And out of that came a lot of scenes and a kind of more imaginative reinterpretations. And for example, we stood also with people outside one of those fancy hoardings, which promises you this flat with like exposed brick walls and champagne glasses. And of course, it's never going to be like this, right? And but then people have the right to veto their own footage. So that's in all my films, which are done collaboratively. Also in my new film, Here for Life, that was the same. So people can look at the footage before the film goes out. And it's always the most, it's always, you know, it's a delicate moment, but it allows, that safeguarding allows people to also feel that they can go further and can try out stuff, and they know they have the right to withdraw it. So it takes away some of that feeling that maybe, oh, I don't want to go there because there's a risk. And then as time passes, and then I can watch it the second time just before the film comes out after the rough cut. And the surprising thing is always like how people often say, why is that not in the film? Rather than say, I want this out, they want to have certain things in. For example, John Hall, who has like severe Parkinson's, and I filmed with him for quite a long time, he wanted to use the space in the film in order to say, this is, you're not alone. If you ever see this film, you're not alone. If you're a single person who has no family in a council estate, you won't be alone because I'm also here, right, going through this. It was a really powerful understanding also for me. How can I open up these spaces of the film to make cinema and show people's beauty, but also in their struggle, right? And like to make a space that is really full of them. And I'm almost, my skill is to hold it together, to bring it together and to bring it to life. So for me, there's this process of working with the community, or in the different kind of formations in all my films is slightly different. But it's also really important. So the process is long, but the film as an object after is really crucial for me, because that's what travels without us and without me. So that's my artwork, right? Like, or not my artwork personally, but this is the skill that I bring in order to show these lives and these meanings that we are producing together to the larger world, and to therefore say we can't be erased, we exist, you know, and you can't get rid of us. And just last thing, sorry, Mikhail, I don't want to hog all the space, but the important thing is for me you know, they're always the same languages that are narrating certain experiences, and they have a certain beginning, they have a certain structure in filmic language. I mean, so people get mentored to speak these languages, and there has to be a coherence in this act structure and in the way in which you are telling a narrative, and we have to battle with that all the time, right? So if I get film funding, I would have to submit myself to a certain degree to that structure, and I can't, because for me that's ideological. So we need to find our own language. I need to understand these languages, but they are simplified languages in order to just speak a universal monoform coda, which everyone then can understand, or people think they can understand. But we have way more complex understanding possibilities. People are not stupid, but we are making them stupid through these homogeneous languages, right? So it's really crucial to find the language through the work and with the work that then becomes alive as a film afterwards.
I really relate to the process that you're describing. Sometimes because a lot of my work actually comes from sound, and you know, from a very young age, I was very much into sound. In fact, it was my mom's birthday recently, and you know, on the phone she was telling me this is really not related, but she was telling me that I have a twin sister, and she was telling me that when we were babies, she was crying a lot, whereas I wasn't. I didn't seem to complain very much. But what I was doing instead, when she was crying in the middle of the night, I would get up and dance. So I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. Even then, I had this slight curiosity about sound and what is musical sound, what is rhythmic sound, what is non-musical, you know, what is noise and what is music. So I think that a lot of my process, I can associate with the idea of the open score. So, you know, there are different elements that I'm discovering in a place through relationships, through site visits, through, you know, photographing. And these become elements which then, by creating this kind of open score, or creating situations or orchestrating situations within which the participants or performers then they can interpret, and they can negotiate those key elements of notation. So if we use that parallel, they can negotiate and interpret those or express themselves within those in their own way. So they provide a lot of the kind of emotional content and narrative content. And then I think my responsibility is to kind of somehow structure it, which is, again, I think comes from a kind of compositional experience or musical experience. Now, in response to your question about how the communities responded to the work, again, what is a community? That's another big question, because I don't want to homogenize them into, you know, under this word, because all of them were different, and they all chose to have different kinds of the people I interacted with, that ranged from former workers to politicians, local politicians, to local academics, to local activists, and of course children and the industry. These are different communities. But what was overwhelming by the end was the fact that there was a kind of sense of celebration, especially on the part of the families, the local politicians, and the children. I mean, the children's response was utterly moving, you know, and it was very moving. Very often I kind of think, okay, so what does it do? Why am I doing this kind of work? Why do I feel it's important? So when we started the project, I had consultations with the local mayor and families, and I asked them what they think. One of the questions was what they thought the children's future would be. And without exception, everybody said, oh, our children can't stay here. You know, there's no future for them here. There are no jobs. They have to leave, go to a big city. The industry, the factory told me, the power plant told me the same. When I asked the children, one of the first encounters that I had with them, I asked them the same question. So I'm talking about children between the ages of 5 and 12, and it was 50 of them. only one child said that she wanted to stay. All of the others said that they wanted to leave. And then I thought, this is so interesting. So, but whose narrative is this? Did they think about this themselves? Is it the parents? But then is it what they tell them in school? At the end of the project, after the entire process that lasted over a year, I asked them the same question again. And there was a scream, this kind of yell saying, no, we want to stay. I'm not deluded. I mean, I'm not delusional. I don't think that, they're not obliged to stick to that. But I think something happened through the creative process. And through that, how they felt they actually have ownership of the place and they have ownership of their own narratives. It's like, if we want to imagine that we're going to stay, we have the right to do that, even if it contradicts what the school tells us or what our parents tell us. Maybe we can see an alternative. Maybe we can come up with solutions. And in fact, we did some sort of futurological urban designs with the children, and they were amazing. So there was a very interesting transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of having ownership of a place really does give you a sense of pride, and really gives you a sense of belonging that perhaps other overarching narratives don't actually endorse in a way. I would love to ask you guys a little bit about your thoughts on presenting these works through a digital exhibition as well, and if there's anything that you feel was gained or was lost in this form of presentation.
The beginning of my film was lost, the first 10 minutes. That's a big loss. I'm not joking. Everyone who's watched this, you have to watch the beginning, please, on the Unquiet Moments. No, it just started already with Elam and Lorna talking about home. So the beginning is really crucial because it sets the whole flavor of the film, and is different from how it proceeds. So the beginning is crucial. So, yeah, that you can lose that. Technology is sometimes against us. I mean, the potential, of course, is that it reaches more people. But then the danger is what we just saw happen, right? And it just can happen, however much prepared one is. There's a ghost in the machine. So in a cinema, you would notice it and you would just start again and people won't leave, right? Whereas on such a platform, people might just go, oh my God, what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, in the case of my work, because I make short, like maximum 20-minute long works, mostly, unless it's a kind of durational installation. And they're designed to be sold, because for me, there's something that is very important, which is the embodied experience of the image and sound. How sound actually resonates in your body. And I don't know why, but I'm kind of the abstraction of a two-dimensional experience of an image that hovers, or just sound that is in your ears. To me, is just one way of experiencing a work. But maybe because I did too much clubbing when I was in my 20s, and I remember that experience of sound, like absolutely reorganizing your intestines and your bones, and that's an experience that I just think is irreplaceable. It's just such a to be in contact with sound, or for sound to enter you, I think it's just it can be a very deep experience, especially when it's voices, other people's voices inhabiting your body. I just find it it can offer incredible moments of union with others.
But I think this is also like when we had the screenings in the cinemas, or when we have screenings in London, and people from this day come to screenings. So Eric, who's now sadly passed away, but he would come to all the screenings and narrate the film. So basically, people would then come back to see the film the third time just to sit next to Eric. So there was a competition who could sit next to Eric to hear his narration, which would always change a little bit. And then he would say, so then it's going to happen, and then I'm going to come and do this. It was unbelievably amazing. So there's another element of it, or when we showed it, for example, at the Tate screening with a few other people together, and one of the women just sang along the whole way through. She just sang all the songs, the old East End songs, and it was really magical because it allows for a bleeding of life into the work, into a space which is collective because we are sitting there together. So the different spaces offer really different possibilities, for sure.
And I love I didn't go to that screening. I was at the screening at the Rio in Hackney, but I love the idea of someone singing along and how that song is a kind of offering, or is a kind of gift to the gift that you kind of gave them in a way, and yourself and the community. When we had the very first opening of the exhibition of Children of Unquiet, which included other works as well, part of the same project in Florence, the children came and they told me they had a surprise, which took the form of a song. They made a song, which was inspired again by the sounds of the landscape, and it was again such a gift. It was very, very moving.
It was beautiful.
So I have an audience question for you guys, opening it up to audience questions. If anyone is interested in putting them in the comments, we'll select them and say them out loud. But what was the most difficult part of making these works? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, the most difficult aspect tends to be funding.
Yeah, I was going to say the same.
funding. That was very hard. Things have been getting better since then, but always, I think, working with people. I always say that so far I've been very lucky. I have never fallen out with anybody. There's never really any conflict directly with me. It's sometimes difficult when you negotiate different kinds of people within a closed kind of circuit. So this one, when the industry and the former workers, they used to be in very close proximity, and how that they fell out. But I had to be the one that is in conversation with both of them. So that somehow positioning yourself, I think, as an artist, as someone who doesn't take position, which is impossible. That can be very hard. I'm not sure. How about you, Andrea? How do you find that?
I found apart from the funding, because the state had literally no funding at all. It cost so little, but I lived on the estate, so it was possible to do it in that way. But the most difficult thing, I think, for me is I hover between, say, for example, so I make a lot of effort to get the work shown after. So I would always show it within the community, to the people that I worked with first, and then also in places such as this estate. So we went through loads and loads of community centers, loads of estates. But I do want to show my work in cinemas and in galleries too. And when I had the show, for example, in Spike Island, what was really amazing to have 6 weeks where people could watch the film over and over in parts, and they did. And I didn't know would that work with a feature film, but we made sure that it was very comfortable seating, and it really worked really amazingly. And what's really difficult for me, I think, is to get constantly told, oh, you have to make a choice. Do you want to be a filmmaker? Do you want to be an artist working in galleries? So filmmakers like me who work on feature film, but work with an expression that the film industry here doesn't support, I see myself much more like in between. Like, we are quite fluid, right? But the structures around us are not so easily fluid, so it's harder to get support. And when support comes, then you think, oh, it's going to happen again in this way, but it's very difficult to keep the spaces open. And I find that really a shame a little bit, because we make so much work, like a lot of the artists make so much work and cross these boundaries and thresholds all the time, but then we are being blocked. The same as like it's with film funding, you have to perform, you have to maneuver, and I don't like that. I find it hard, and it's not like I come for money, right? Like at all, I don't, so I believe in works, and I believe in a variety of works, and I believe in all sorts of different languages that have to be spoken that are suppressed because of this problem. So some of us might make it, and they might make these works, and they're wayward and unruly, but we haven't got a structure yet that supports that. And I find that really impoverishing of the art culture here, as well as the film culture. It's I mean, there are things that are changing, but it has still a long way to go to really truly appreciate what could be possible if people would be supported in a different way. And we had that once before. I mean, if you think about back to the 80s, for example, the way in which film funding, arts funding worked was different. So I think that there are perhaps different models now that will come out that will change that. But I think it's those are the things, the discussions and conversations that we're having sometimes feel like we've been around a few times, these discussions, right? And they keep coming around until there's real change. And I'd like to see change. And also, like, why, really yeah, sorry. And also why is, no, sorry, but why are, artists always labeled like these are outsider artists, or these are, it's the same question. Why is Shakespeare not somebody who's using a wheelchair, for example, or somebody who has another kind of, is neurodiverse or something? Like, until we actually have like an understanding deep down where we can really say this is, we are open to whoever takes these roles or who's participating in a show because of the way in which they work and the way in which they speak a language that we might even understand because we're open enough to allow ourselves to not understand. That would be really beautiful to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of building off of that question as well, we have another audience question, which is, who do you hope sees your artworks?
Who answers that, Andrea? Well, I think similar to Andrea, the first people that see my works are the people who participate in them. In fact, I always present the work. It doesn't matter if they are 7-year-olds or 27 or 87. I always present them the kind of pre-final cut, the pre-final edit to them to get responses, whatever form that response takes. So hopefully they are the first audience. And then I mean, the work inhabits, I think, different projects perhaps invite different guests, different types of audience. I don't know why, because I don't really radically change the form. But a lot of, when the work is shown in festivals, there is a different kind of audience that goes there. When the work is shown in museums or biennials, there's a kind of slightly different kind of audience there. But works like I made a film which is called Ain't Got No Fear with teenage boys, and the film takes the form of a kind of music video come documentary, and we thought about audiences, with the boys, and they told me the most important audience for us is our classmates. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, so how do we make that possible? And they said, well, put it on YouTube, put it on whatever, online for free, kind of open access. And this is what we did for that film. Because this is how they shared it, on the mobile phones, they shared it with their friends, and this is how they experienced that work. Yeah, how about you, Andrea?
I mean, with my last film, for example, similar to Estate, I learned everything more or less bringing Estate into the world because it needed to reach this different audience, and I'm quite willful. Like, I want these interactions between different people, and I don't want to just speak to also one audience, but I'm trying to always reach across, because in a way that's what interests me too, is like to reach across these yeah, and the conversations that happen. So the film is an object for another kind of discussion, right? Therefore, but you know, with my new film, for example, I mean, we've been going to also prisons. We have cinemas, prisons, film festivals, like, and I'm against the way in which we have prisons, obviously, right? But these are interesting discussions, I think, these films, because they're also they're asking these questions, like in my case, often in our case, I think, because they're so collaborative, right? But they belong not just to me, they belong also to the people in the film. And so people in the film can do what they want with the film too. They have the right to show the film in whatever way they would like to. But I extend that outwards. So for example, I try to, like, if there's an exhibition, like, you know, in a community space, there'll be a discussion attached to it. If it's in a cinema, hopefully there'll be a Q&A. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. But even if it's run by the people who are organizing it themselves in some way. So it's a difficult one. I mean, I think multiple platforms are really, really important and are really crucial, but they take a lot of labor and effort. And I think we have to make that effort. And of course you would do it, right? And I would do it, but there's a lot needs to be done to make that maybe a bit more widespread, because there's a lot of potential and possibility within that, I think, because we want to engage, you know. It's like going to a library. I always think, like, I go in a library. Why I like libraries is I go for that book, but I come out with 10 different books, right? Exactly. So how do you make that possible? So there are strategies, right, in order to reach that.
Absolutely. So I have one final audience question for you as well, which is, how do you feel that in this time of global pandemic, your works have gained a new sense of poignancy?
I don't want to make you go first, but
I mean, it's not an easy. I mean, the answer is not easy, because obviously we haven't encountered anything like this within a lifetime. And when I was making Children of Unquiet, I mean, there's something about this kind of desolate environment that children come into, that basically they inherit something that it's beyond them. It's been passed on to them. It's a legacy of a failed human project that is passed on to them, and they have to reinvent it somehow. And I think there's something about this moment that gives us, obviously it's awful for a lot of people, for everybody, but some people, especially those who are most vulnerable in our societies, have been affected the most. And I think it's a really important moment to reassess how we are in relation to nature, in relation to our extractive economies, and in relation to each other. You know, why are we together? It was very moving to see, you know, earlier on in the pandemic, during the lockdown, you know, what Spanish people would do. You know, they would open the windows. So in Italy, they would open the windows and sing to one another. And then I thought, okay, this is incredible. You know, we are still discovering what it is to be together, even when we are, or especially because we are in these moments of isolation and physical remoteness, that we are reassessing what it is to be together. We have to, we feel we have the urge to invent different ways of being together. And I think there's something about that. That I find Children of Unquiet somehow touches upon. It suggests different ways of inhabiting a space, reappropriating a space, making sense of a kind of disaster, and trying to change the rules.
I think that I mean, to add to that, just I want to ask us all to consider, of course, and I mean, I think not me asking, who am I, but like we have to ask to consider all the time, like to undo, for example, racism and racist policies and sexist policies and ableist policies takes a lot of work. And that work is done always by the people who are at the receiving end of all sorts of structural inequalities. And those are the people who have to make community happen. And those are the people who make community happen and care happen over and over again. And however heartwarming community is, because it makes itself, and those that have the least or struggle the most will look out for each other always, I think, as they can. But the structures of power are the ones who continue on. You know, we might say that it'll be a greener world, there will be a world that will have, you know, disability justice, will have Black feminism at its core, for example. Will that really be a world where power will give itself up to that? I would hope so. I think we have to, and we have to, because those are the bodies which are the ones who are the most affected. You know, the bodies again that have, or the economically marginalized, or the global majority bodies. Like, we have to make a change, and the change has to, yeah, power has to give up some of its power, and it really has to profoundly change. I mean, I get between hope and despair a lot. It hovers, because immediately now we go back to as if it was normal on a certain level.
But do you think then, if I may ask, repeat the current question, but do you think that that viewing a state now, a reverie now, after having been in isolation, somehow makes us think of moments of isolation, you know, in our flats, living on our own, and the need, and yeah, do you think it makes us think differently about?
There are so many people who live in isolation because of all sorts of different reasons all the time, and we just don't notice them, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So, and I think in the state, like, there are a lot of these people were people who were very private and couldn't go out for several reasons, right? Be it physical, or be it like because they had some fear or whatever. And I think it's about a consideration, like what we see almost as a leveler, is only that if the memory extends itself. And I think that's the work we all have to do. And I would hope, you know, there was a more friendly way of being with each other, I felt like, during lockdown. And I've seen the first people shout at each other because they're in their way on the canal or something. So it goes back very quickly. I mean, these are minor things, but I think these things are all part of the kind of bigger consideration. Do you see another as a human being that is worthy of this person stepping in your way, and it might have been an accident, not a malicious intent or something, you know? It's those kind of things. I think we have to do a lot of work, and hopefully, you know, we will do the work, but regardless of the structures.
I think with that, it brings us to time. And so I wanted to thank you both so much for this wonderful discussion. Really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your schedule to do so. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in and submitted questions. It was really lovely having you here. So with that, I'll turn it back to Somerset House.
Thank you.
Thank you.